The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow over the rolling fields. A warm breeze rustled through the tall, dry grass, carrying with it the familiar sense of earth and hay. But something was wrong. The usual peaceful hum of the countryside was drowned out by a low, menacing buzz, a sound that vibrated through the air like an approaching storm. In the middle of the pasture, Boone, a majestic quarter horse, lay collapsed, his massive body writhing in agony. Thousands of bees crawled over his sweat-drenched coat, their tiny bodies moving like a living, pulsating mass. His flanks heaved as he struggled for breath, his nostrils flaring wildly. He was suffocating under the weight of the swarm. His dark eyes, once filled with strength and fire, now reflected nothing but sheer terror and pain. He tried to kick, to rise, but his powerful legs trembled violently, giving out beneath him. The venom was overtaking his body. From the other side of the field, Delaney Carter sprinted toward him, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Her stomach twisted into a knot of pure dread. She had seen Boone distressed before, injured, sick, but never like this. Her hands shook, and her mind raced through every possible explanation. Had he disturbed a hidden hive? Had something driven the bees into a frenzy? Why weren't they stopping? She stopped several yards away, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sight before her was something out of a nightmare. Boone's skin had swollen beneath the unrelenting stings, his sleek coat now riddled with welts. Every breath he took was weaker than the last. She had to act. But how? If she ran in blindly, the swarm would turn on her. She could already feel a few rogue bees buzzing around her head, sensing the movement. Her fingers twitched at her sides. She couldn't just stand there. Boone was dying. Think. Delaney. Think. Then, suddenly, something shifted in the air. A gust of wind rolled through the pasture, rustling the dry grass, and for a split second, the swarm hesitated. The buzzing faltered, just slightly, as if the entire hive had been disturbed by some unseen force. Delaney's breath caught in her throat. And then, it happened. From the distant trees, a flock of birds burst into the sky, moving like dark streaks against the setting sun. Swifts! Dozens of them. They dove through the air with deadly precision, slicing through the chaos, their sharp beaks snapping up bees in mid-flight. One after another, they attacked, diving and twisting in a synchronized dance of survival. Delaney watched, wide-eyed, as nature itself seemed to intervene. It was a miracle. The bees, once an unrelenting mass of rage, began to lose their formation. Their movements became frantic, disorganized. Some scattered, flying erratically, while others fled entirely. This was her chance. Delaney didn't hesitate. She bolted toward Boone, her boots pounding against the earth. The buzzing still filled her ears, but she didn't care. She wouldn't let him die. She grabbed the heavy tarp draped over the nearby fence, yanked it free, and ran straight toward him. She didn't know if she would make it in time, but she had to try. Delaney's feet barely touched the ground as she sprinted toward Boone, her lungs burning with every desperate breath. The sharp scent of sweat and venom filled the air, mixing with the acrid sting of the bees' pheromones. The buzzing still echoed in her ears, though the once solid swarm had begun to break apart. The swifts, those incredible life-saving birds, continued their aerial assault, darting through the sky like black arrows, snatching bees straight from the air. But Boone wasn't moving. Delaney's heart lurched in her chest. His chest was still rising, but barely. His breath, once strong and steady, came in thin, erratic gasps. His massive body twitched involuntarily, his muscles spasming from the sheer amount of venom coursing through his veins. The tarp in her hands felt impossibly heavy, but she forced herself to keep moving. A sharp sting erupted on her forearm. Then another, on the side of her neck. The bees had noticed her. She clenched her jaw and kept running. Pain didn't matter. Boone did. When she finally reached him, She threw the tarp over his massive body, covering as much of him as she could. Her hands trembled as she began brushing away the bees that still clung to his face, his swollen muzzle, his eyes that were usually so full of fire and strength. Now they looked distant, glazed. "No, no, no. Boone, stay with me," she whispered, her voice cracking. His breathing was slowing. Too much. Too fast. The reality hit her like a freight train. He was slipping away. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed a hand to his heaving chest, feeling the weak, unsteady rhythm of his heart beneath her palm. She had to get him help. No. She reached for her phone, only to realize it was still in the truck. Too far away. If she ran back for it, she might return to find Boone already gone. And then, as if the universe had heard her silent plea, she heard it, the distant roar of an engine. A truck. The sound grew louder, tires skidding against the dirt road, sending dust billowing into the air. The vehicle barreled toward the pasture, then came to a sharp stop near the fence. A door flew open before the truck had even fully stopped. A tall figure leapt out, Mac Holloway. Delaney barely registered his shocked expression as he took in the sight before him. Boone sprawled across the ground, covered in swelling welts, the last of the bees still clinging to his skin, the sheer panic written across her face. Jesus Christ, Delaney! What the hell happened? No time, she gasped, her voice hoarse. He's in shock. I need help now. Mac didn't hesitate. He sprinted back to his truck, yanking open the tailgate and grabbing a thick wool blanket and a length of rope. Delaney refused to let her hands stop moving, brushing away the last remaining bees, feeling the heat radiating off Boone's feverish body. His breathing was barely there now. She could feel it. He was on the edge. Mac ran back to her side, dropping to his knees. "We have to get him up," he said, his voice urgent but steady. "If he stays down, his organs are gonna shut down." "You ready?" Delaney nodded, even though she wasn't. Together, they had one last chance to save Boone. But was it already too late? Delaney's hands shook uncontrollably as she pressed them against Boone's heaving side, feeling the erratic rise and fall of his breath. His coat, once sleek and strong, was now drenched in sweat and swollen with venom, his muscles twitching under the weight of his own body. If he didn't get up soon, his organs would shut down. Mac crouched beside her, his face grim as he looped the rope around Boone's front legs, securing it tight but careful enough not to cause further pain. "We're gonna have to lift him," he said, his voice strained but determined. "If he stays down much longer, he's done." Delaney swallowed hard. She knew he was right. Quarter horses were built for power and endurance, but even the strongest animals couldn't survive something like this forever. Boone let out a deep, shuddering exhale. His ears twitched slightly at the sound of Mac's voice, but there was no fight left in his body. "No," Delaney whispered fiercely, pressing her forehead against his damp neck. "You are not giving up on me." Mac gave her a brief, sharp nod. It was now or never. With a strength fueled by sheer desperation, they heaved together, pulling against the rope, pushing against Boone's side, trying to coax him up. His legs trembled, his muscles quivering as if his body wanted to respond, but his strength was nearly gone. "Come on, Boone." Delaney gritted her teeth, her entire body screaming from the strain. Every fiber of her being willed him to rise. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't. For a moment, it felt like he was done. His breathing was weak. His body was limp. A devastating stillness settled over the field. And then, a flicker of movement. Boone groaned low in his throat, his ears flicking back. His front legs tensed, his back muscles coiling like an engine trying to restart. Delaney's breath caught. "Yes. That's it, boy, fight," Mac shouted, pulling harder. With one final, agonizing push, Boone lurched forward. His legs buckled, his hooves slipping against the dirt, But then, miraculously, he found his footing. Delaney let out a sob as Boone staggered upright, swaying but standing. His breathing was still ragged, his body still weak, but he was alive. Mac clapped a hand on Delaney's shoulder, his grip tight. "We're not done yet. We gotta get him moving." Delaney wiped at her tear-streaked face and nodded fiercely. Boone was up, but his battle for survival had just begun. Boone stood, but just barely. His legs trembled beneath him, his body swaying like a tree in a violent storm. Delaney kept her hands against his damp coat, as if willing her strength into him. His breathing was still shallow, his sides rising and falling too fast, too unsteady. He wasn't safe yet. Mac took a step back, watching Boone closely. "He's standing, but he's still in shock. We need to keep him moving." Delaney nodded, though fear clawed at her chest. Boone wasn't responding like he should. Normally, a horse that had gone down like this would be panicked, anxious to run. But he just stood there, his head low, his eyes distant. Too still. She swallowed hard. "Come on, big guy," she said softly, tugging at his halter. "We're not done yet." Boone's ears flicked, but he didn't move. Delaney exchanged a nervous glance with Mac. This wasn't good. If Boone didn't start walking soon, the venom still in his system could cause his body to shut down entirely. She took a slow breath, trying to stay calm, but her hands were shaking. Mac sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "We might need to get the vet out here." Delaney's stomach twisted. The vet was an hour away. She didn't know if Boone had an hour. They had to do something now. Then, out of nowhere, Boone's body shuddered violently. His skin rippled, his muscles contracting, and for a terrifying second, Delaney thought he was going to collapse again. "No, no, no, Boone, stay up," she pleaded, pressing a hand to his neck. Mac cursed under his breath. "We need to force him to move. If we don't, his circulation is gonna crash." Delaney didn't hesitate. She grabbed the lead rope and pulled hard. Boone stumbled forward, his hooves dragging in the dirt, his body sluggish, but he moved. "That's it, Boone," Delaney breathed. She pulled again, walking step by step, her heart pounding. Boone followed, slowly, hesitantly, his body weak but trying. Mac walked alongside them, ready to steady Boone if he wobbled. "We need to keep him walking for at least 15 minutes. 15 minutes. It sounded like forever. Boone was fighting with everything he had left, and she didn't know if it would be enough. With every step, she whispered encouragements. "You're strong. You can do this. Just keep moving, boy." Boone's ears flicked slightly at her voice. A sign of life. A spark of awareness returning. Delaney held onto that hope like a lifeline. Because she wasn't ready to say goodbye. Not yet. Boone's hooves dragged heavily through the dirt, each step a monumental effort. His once powerful legs, built for speed and endurance, now trembled beneath his weight, threatening to give out at any moment. His coat, normally sleek and strong, was drenched in sweat, darkened by exhaustion and shock. Every breath he took was a battle. Delaney gripped the lead rope with both hands, her knuckles white from the strain. She could feel the weight of his struggle through the tension in the rope, through the way his body sagged with every step forward. Her heart clenched painfully. Boone was fighting, but she could see how close he was to the edge. Mac walked beside them, his boots kicking up dust with each step. His face was tight with concern, his sharp blue eyes locked onto Boone's every move. "He's barely holding on," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Delaney swallowed hard, trying to ignore the lump in her throat. She knew that. She could see it in the way Boone's ears drooped, the way his head hung low, his breathing still ragged and uneven. He was pushing himself past his limits. But he had to. If he stopped now, he might never get up again. "Just a little longer, Boone," Delaney murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Stay with me, boy. You can do this." The quarter horse snorted weakly, his nostrils flaring, but he didn't stop moving. Delaney clung to that small victory, even as dread curled in her stomach like a vice. She could feel him getting weaker with every step. Then, suddenly, he stumbled. It happened in a split second. His front legs buckled beneath him, his knees nearly crashing into the ground. Delaney's heart stopped. "No!" She yanked on the rope, digging her heels into the dirt, trying to steady him. Mac reacted just as fast. He threw his shoulder against Boone's massive frame, trying to keep him upright. "Come on, Boone. Don't quit now." For a terrifying moment, Boone swayed dangerously. His breathing hitched. His entire body shook. Delaney could feel it happening. He was slipping away again, his body shutting down. No, not now. Not after everything. Tears burned at the edges of her vision as she pressed a hand against his damp neck. "Please, Boone. Please." And then, something shifted. Boone snorted loudly, his ears twitching. His muscles, though weak, tightened. His legs locked into place. His head lifted, just barely, but enough. Something inside him had reignited. Delaney's breath caught in her throat. Mac's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "There you go, big guy. That's it." And then, Boone took another step. It wasn't much. His stride was still weak, still unsteady, but it was different. His body wasn't just moving because she was pulling him forward. He was moving because he wanted to. Delaney let out a shaky breath, blinking rapidly against the moisture gathering in her eyes. She reached up, running a trembling hand down his sweat-slicked neck. "That's my boy," she whispered. "That's my fighter." Mac exhaled heavily, tension draining from his shoulders. "He might actually make it," he said, though his voice still held a trace of caution. Delaney didn't respond. She wasn't ready to believe it yet. Not until Boone was strong enough to hold himself up without help. Not until he could breathe without struggling. Not until she was sure this nightmare was truly over. But for the first time since this began, there was hope. And Boone, against all odds, was still standing. The sky had darkened to a deep shade of blue, the last remnants of sunlight fading behind the distant hills. The once oppressive heat of the day had given way to a crisp evening breeze, but Delaney hardly noticed. Her entire world was Boone. The quarter horse still stood, his body swaying slightly, his breath slow but steady. He was alive, but the fight wasn't over yet. His legs trembled beneath his weight, and every step forward felt like a struggle. The venom had weakened him, but he was trying. Mac, standing close, kept a watchful eye on Boone's every move. "He needs water," he muttered. "He's lost too much fluid. His muscles are cramping." Delaney nodded, her throat tight. She knew he was right. Boone's coat, usually smooth and shining, was now drenched in sweat, darkened with dirt and exhaustion. Every muscle in his body had been pushed to its absolute limit. Taking a deep breath, Delaney led him toward the water trough. Each step was painfully slow. Boone's hooves dragged, his head hung low, but he followed. That, in itself, was a miracle. When they finally reached the trough, Boone hesitated. His nostrils flared as he sniffed at the water, but he didn't drink. Delaney's stomach twisted. He had to drink. If he didn't, his body wouldn't be able to flush out the toxins, and he could still go into organ failure. "Come on, boy," she murmured, running a hand along his damp neck. "You need this." Boone blinked slowly, his ears flicking at the sound of her voice. Then, finally, he dipped his muzzle into the water and took a shallow sip. Then another. Then another. Delaney let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Mac clapped a hand on her shoulder. "That's a damn good sign." For the first time all day, Delaney allowed herself a small, exhausted smile. Boone was drinking. Boone was standing. Boone was alive. The fight wasn't over yet. But for the first time, she truly believed they were going to win. The rhythmic sound of Boone lapping up water was the only thing keeping Delaney grounded. Each sip sent a wave of cautious relief through her, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Boone was far from safe. His body had endured hours of relentless venom, his muscles were still trembling, and his breathing remained shallow. This wasn't over yet. Mac leaned against the fence, his face still tense with worry. "He's drinking," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's good. But he's still weak." He hesitated before adding, "If he collapses again, Delaney, we might not be able to get him up." Delaney's stomach twisted, but she refused to entertain that thought. Not now. Not when Boone had fought so hard. She watched as he lifted his head from the trough, water dripping from his swollen muzzle. His eyes, though still heavy with exhaustion, finally looked focused. They weren't clouded with pain or dazed from shock, Boone was aware. It wasn't much, but to Delaney, it was everything. She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You scared me today, big guy." She ran her hand gently down his sweat-soaked neck, feeling the heat still radiating from his body. Boone exhaled heavily, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of her voice. It was the first real response he had given her all day. A lump rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wouldn't break down now. Boone had fought for his life. She needed to fight for him too. The night air had turned crisp, and Boone was still too unsteady to be left alone. His body had been through too much, and if the venom had caused any internal damage, they wouldn't know until morning. He needed warmth. He needed to be somewhere safe. "We should move him to the barn," Delaney said, looking at Mac. "Let him rest on soft bedding. Keep an eye on him overnight." Mac nodded, his expression serious. "Let's go slow. If he struggles, we stop." With Boone's lead rope in her hands, Delaney gave a gentle tug. Boone hesitated for a moment, his legs still weak beneath him, but then he stepped forward. It was sluggish, shaky, but he moved. And as Delaney walked beside him, guiding him toward the barn under the cold glow of the rising moon, she dared to believe Boone wasn't done fighting. The barn was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of hay and the rhythmic sound of Boone's uneven breathing. The dim glow from the overhead light flickered slightly, casting long, wavering shadows against the wooden walls. Normally, this place was a sanctuary, a place of comfort and routine. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt fragile. Boone stood in the center of his stall, his legs still trembling beneath his weight. He hadn't tried to lie down once. Delaney knew why. He was afraid. Too weak to stand for much longer, yet too terrified that if he went down, he wouldn't be able to get back up. The thought made her chest tighten. Boone had fought too hard to make it this far. She wasn't about to let him lose now. She spread a thick layer of fresh bedding beneath him, carefully fluffing the straw with her hands. "You'll be more comfortable if you rest," she murmured, as if her voice alone could convince him. Boone didn't respond. He just stood there, head hanging low, his ears flicking slightly at her voice but not lifting. His body was exhausted, but his mind was still locked in survival mode. Mac leaned against the stall door, arms crossed, his face tense. "He's still got that glazed look in his eyes," he muttered. "We need to keep an eye on him all night. If he takes a turn for the worse..." He let the words hang in the air. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Delaney already knew. The venom might have stopped working against him, but his body was still processing the damage. There was no guarantee he would make it until morning. Delaney grabbed a towel and gently wiped away the last of the sweat and grime clinging to Boone's coat. He flinched at the first touch, his muscles twitching involuntarily, but then he let out a slow, shuddering breath and relaxed beneath her hand. It was the first real sign that he was allowing himself to trust again. A lump rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "You're gonna be okay," she whispered, not sure if she was saying it for Boone's sake or her own. The hours stretched on. Boone shifted his weight every few minutes, never fully still, never fully at ease. Delaney watched him like a hawk, checking his breathing, his heartbeat, looking for any sign that things were getting worse. Mac sat on an overturned feed bucket outside the stall, his presence silent but steady. Neither of them were leaving Boone alone tonight. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its mournful cry echoing through the empty fields. The night pressed in around them, thick with exhaustion and fear. All they could do now was wait. Boone had survived the worst, but would he have the strength to make it until dawn? The barn was eerily quiet, except for the steady drip of water from the rafters and the slow, labored sound of Boone's breathing. The night had stretched on endlessly, every second feeling heavier than the last. The weight of exhaustion pressed against Delaney's chest, but she refused to close her eyes. She had spent too many hours fearing this exact moment, waiting for the silence to swallow Boone whole. She watched him carefully, taking in every detail. His coat was still damp with sweat, his sides rising and falling with effort. He was still on his feet, but just barely. His legs trembled, shifting uneasily, and every now and then, he let out a deep shuddering breath that made her heart skip a beat. He was holding on, but for how much longer? Mac was sitting on an overturned feed bucket outside the stall, arms crossed, his hat pulled low over his forehead. He hadn't spoken in a while, but his presence was solid, unwavering. She was grateful for that. If Boone took a turn for the worse, she didn't know if she could face it alone. A gust of wind rattled the barn doors, making them creak against their hinges. Delaney barely flinched. Her entire focus was Boone, his breathing, his stance, the flicker of awareness in his eyes. He had made it this far, but something in her gut told her they weren't out of the woods yet. Then it happened. Boone swayed hard to one side, his legs buckling beneath him. Delaney shot forward, instinct taking over, her hands grasping at his halter. "No, Boone, stay up," she cried, her voice sharp with panic. If he went down again, there was no getting him back up. Mac was beside her in an instant, pressing a firm hand against Boone's shoulder, his voice calm but urgent. "Come on, big guy. Just a little longer." Boone let out a deep, strained exhale, his body trembling from the effort of keeping himself upright. His ears flicked slightly at the sound of their voices, and for a terrifying moment, Delaney thought he was going to collapse completely. But then, against all odds, he found his footing again. Delaney's breath hitched as Boone planted his hooves, standing tall despite the exhaustion threatening to pull him under. He wasn't strong, but he was trying. God, he was trying. Mac let out a slow breath, running a hand down his face. Damn, that was close. Delaney pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the frantic beat of her own heart. Too close. She didn't dare move away from him now. Not when he was still standing on the edge of survival. The night wasn't over yet. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink, gold, and lavender. The darkness of the night, thick and suffocating, was finally retreating, but Delaney still couldn't let her guard down. She had been waiting for this moment, praying for it, clinging to the hope that Boone would survive until morning. But even as the sun began its slow rise, the fear in her chest refused to fully ease. Boone still stood, his frame weak and unsteady, but he was upright. That alone felt like a miracle. His breathing, though still shallow, had steadied into something more controlled. His ears twitched at the distant sounds of the waking farm, and when Delaney stepped closer, his dark, expressive eyes met hers. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, there was clarity in his gaze. He was still weak, his body battered and exhausted, but he was present. He had fought. And he had survived. Mac stretched his arms, rolling his stiff shoulders as he exhaled heavily. "Damn, Carter," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "I've seen a lot of tough horses in my time, but this one? He's something else." Delaney let out a shaky breath, her entire body aching from the hours of tension, fear, and desperation. She wanted to say something, but her throat felt tight. Instead, she reached up, gently running her fingers through Boone's sweat-dampened mane. His coat was still warm beneath her touch, still real. He was here. He was alive. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself a smile. "I knew he would pull through," she murmured, though deep down, they both knew how close he had come to the edge. Boone shifted slightly, his muscles stiff, his legs unsteady, but there was no panic in his movements. He exhaled slowly, almost as if he was just as relieved as she was. Delaney rested her forehead lightly against his neck, closing her eyes for a moment as the exhaustion finally caught up to her. "You scared the hell out of me, big guy. But you're still standing. You did it." Mac leaned against the stall door, watching them with a smirk. "You need some sleep, Carter." Delaney let out a tired laugh, wiping at the tears she hadn't even realized were streaking down her face. "Yeah, well, I'll sleep when Boone does." The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp hay, fresh earth, and the faint musk of horses. Outside, the world was waking up, birds chirping in the distance, the sound of a rooster crowing from the other side of the property. But none of it mattered to Delaney. All that mattered was that Boone had made it through the night. She didn't know what the next few days would bring. Would he regain his full strength? Would there be complications from the venom? She didn't have the answers, but for now, none of that mattered. Boone had fought harder than any animal she had ever known, and he had won. She ran her hand one last time down his neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath beneath her fingertips. He was here. He was breathing. He was alive. And for now, that was enough.